My mother-in-law's lawyer cleared his throat twice before he could speak. The third time, his voice came out wrong, like someone had grabbed it by the collar. He leaned across the polished oak and whispered 6 words to her. Just 6. And the woman who had spent 14 years looking at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe went the color of old paper. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her hands, those manicured hands that had packed my belongings into hefty bags 2 months earlier, began to shake so hard the diamond ring on her finger caught the courtroom light and threw it across the table like a small distress signal. And I, for the first time since this whole nightmare began, allowed myself to exhale. But I'm jumping ahead. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand exactly how a 31-year-old woman everyone in our zip code thought had completely lost her mind, ended up sitting in that courtroom with a faint, polite smile on her face while her entire former life burned down around her. My name is Juniper Halloran. I'm 31. Until 11 weeks ago, I was married to a man named Carter Voss, and before that, I was the live-in caregiver for his mother, Adelaide Voss, for almost a decade. Yes, you read that right. The mother-in-law. The woman who came to hate me. I'd been her caregiver first. I met Carter when I was 22. I was working through an associate's degree in nursing at a community college in central Ohio, and I needed a job that paid better than the lunch shift at Bob Evans. A friend told me a wealthy family in the next county over needed someone to help with their elderly mother. The mother had early onset Alzheimer's. The family wanted someone live-in. The pay was good. Adelaide Voss was 61 when I started working for her. Sharp-tongued, Southern by way of Charleston, a woman who'd married into the Voss timber and paper money in the 70s and never quite let anyone forget she'd been chosen. She had 2 sons. The older one, Beckett, lived in Denver and called twice a year. The younger one, Carter, lived 2 hours away in Columbus and visited on holidays. For the first 3 years, it was just me and Adelaide and a rotating cast of part-time nurses. I cooked her grits the way she liked them, drove her to her hair appointments, read her the obituaries every Sunday morning because she liked knowing who died, and held her hand when she didn't recognize her own house anymore. By year 2, she was calling me her daughter. By year 3, she told me more than once that I was the kindest person she'd ever known. Carter started visiting more after his father passed. That was year 3. He was 31, charming in that easy Midwest way, working in commercial real estate, and he started showing up on weekends to help with the property. The Voss estate sat on 40 acres outside Granville, with a main house and a guest cottage and a barn that had been converted into a workshop nobody used. He noticed me. I noticed him noticing me. We got married in Adelaide's rose garden when I was 25. She walked herself down the aisle on a good day, looked at me and said with sudden, terrifying clarity, "Don't ever let him forget what you did for me." I should have written that down somewhere safe. The first few years of marriage were good, or at least I thought they were. I kept caring for Adelaide. I finished my nursing degree. I had the baby, our daughter Renly, when I was 27. I kept the house running, kept Adelaide bathed and fed and dignified, kept Renly fed and clean and laughing, and somewhere in there I stopped noticing how much of myself had quietly disappeared. Carter's business was doing well. He was the kind of well where you don't really know what's coming in or going out. You just notice the new car in the driveway and the watches in the dresser drawer. I stopped asking about money around year 5. Whenever I tried, he'd sigh and say, "Sweetheart, that's my department. You handle Mama and Ren. I've got us." I let him have it. That was my first mistake. Not the only one, but the first. Adelaide passed in the spring of my 30th year. Quietly, in her own bed, holding my hand while I sang her the hymn she'd asked for. Carter wasn't home. He'd told me he had a closing in Cincinnati and couldn't get back in time. He came home 12 hours after she died, smelling like a perfume I didn't own. I didn't say anything that night. I was too tired. I'd been awake for 40 hours straight, and my mother-in-law, the woman who'd called me her daughter, was lying down the hall waiting for the funeral home van. There would be time, I thought, to ask Carter where he'd really been. The funeral was on a Tuesday. By Friday, his older brother Beckett was in our kitchen with a folder, and that's where I started paying attention again. Beckett wasn't there to grieve. Beckett was there to talk about the will. Adelaide had updated it 4 years earlier, and Carter, apparently, had not been pleased about that update at the time, and Beckett had not been pleased either. And now Adelaide was in the ground and there was a folder on my kitchen counter, and the two brothers were having a conversation in low voices that stopped the minute I walked in. "Junie, hey!" Carter put on his easy smile. "Why don't you take Ren to the park? We've got some boring estate stuff." I took Ren to the park. When I came back 2 hours later, Beckett was gone, and Carter was on the phone with someone he didn't introduce me to, and the folder had vanished. That was the night I found the first thing. I couldn't sleep. Carter passed out at 11, full of bourbon, and I went downstairs to make tea, and the folder was sitting on his desk in the den with one corner sticking out from under his laptop. I'm a nurse. I work nights. I know how to be quiet. I took that folder into the laundry room with my phone, and I photographed every page. What I read that night cost me about 3 hours of breath. Adelaide had not left the estate to her sons. Adelaide had left the main house, the 40 acres, and a trust worth approximately $1.1 million to me. To Juniper Halloran Voss, in recognition of devoted care and love, freely given when none was owed. The boys got the timber stock and her jewelry. Carter, specifically, got a sealed letter in the workshop barn. That was sitting on my husband's desk on a Friday night in May, and on Saturday morning he kissed me on the forehead and said, "Don't worry about any of that legal stuff, baby. We'll figure it out together." I smiled and said okay, and I started paying very close attention to everything. Over the next 18 months, I learned more than any wife should have to learn about her own marriage. Some of it I learned from the financial records I started photographing whenever Carter left his laptop open. Some of it I learned because I'd spent my 20s caring for an old woman who taught me, between the lucid moments and the fog, that money tells you who people actually are. Carter had been quietly draining what should have been my inheritance for over a year. The trust was held by a regional firm out of Cleveland, and Carter had managed through some combination of charm and forged signatures and an accountant cousin named Whitman to get himself listed as a co-trustee with discretionary withdrawal rights. He had taken just over $240,000 out in 8 months. Some of it had gone into his commercial real estate fund, which I came to learn was not doing well at all. Some had gone into a condo in downtown Columbus that I'd never been told about. Some had gone, and this is the part that nearly broke me, to a woman named Calliope Westbrook, whose name appeared on hotel charges and Cartier receipts, and one transferred sum of $19,000 labeled with breathtaking gall, consulting. Calliope Westbrook was 24. She worked in his office. Of course she did. I didn't say a word. Not to Carter, not to my mother, not to my best friend from nursing school, Rosalind, who had been at our wedding and was, I would later discover, also part of the problem. I sat with it. I kept caring for Renly. I kept making Carter his eggs the way he liked them, soft yolk, no salt, on rye toast. I kept smiling at his mother's friends at the church potlucks, and I started, very quietly, doing 3 things. First, I made copies of everything. Bank statements, transfer records, the original will, Adelaide's handwritten note appointing me caregiver for the last decade of her life. I scanned them, encrypted them, sent them to a private email account he didn't know existed, and I mailed paper copies to my Aunt Mildred in Pittsburgh in a sealed envelope with instructions not to open it unless I asked. Second, I went to see a lawyer. Her name was Henrietta Faulkner. She was 63, ran her own firm out of a converted Victorian in Worthington, and she'd represented 3 women in our county against the kind of man who thought charm was a substitute for ethics. I drove an hour out of my way to see her so I wouldn't run into anyone. Carter knew. I told her everything, and she listened without interrupting once. And then she said, "Honey, we're not going to fight him for this. We're going to let him win, and then we're going to let him discover what he won." Third, I started keeping my own money again. I'd let that lapse during the marriage. I picked up extra night shifts at the long-term care facility where I'd been working part-time, all in cash bonus structures that I deposited into an account in just my name at a credit union 40 miles away. I wasn't building an empire. I was building a runway. While I was doing this, Carter was getting bolder, or stupider, or both. The end came on a Thursday in August. I'd just gotten home from a 12-hour shift. Renly was at her grandmother's, my mother's, for the night. Carter sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where Adelaide had once told me a woman should never sign anything she hadn't read 3 times, and he said, "Juniper, I want a divorce." I didn't react. I'd been waiting for it. He said it like a man delivering a memo. He wanted the main house, the 40 acres, the proceeds of the trust, the Lexus, the Tahoe, the condo in Columbus, which he now mentioned out loud for the first time. He wanted the workshop barn. He wanted the timber stock he'd inherited from his mother. He said I could keep my Toyota, my clothes, my nursing scrubs, and Renly. "You can have Ren," he said, like he was being magnanimous, like he was tipping a waitress. "I think she's better off with her mother anyway. I've got a lot going on right now. Our 4-year-old daughter." He talked about her like she was a houseplant he didn't want to water. Then his mother walked in. Yes, his mother. I forgot to mention that part. Adelaide had a younger sister named Persephone Boss Crane, and after Adelaide died, Persephone had moved into the guest cottage on the property to help with the transition, and she had been living there for 16 months as a kind of resident commentator on my failures. She'd let herself into the back door, the way she always did, and she sat down across from me with the air of someone who'd been waiting for the curtain to go up. "Sweetheart," Persephone said, and patted my hand. "You should have seen this coming. A man like Carter needs a partner who can keep up. You're a sweet girl, but you've always been." She searched for the word, found it, smiled. "Domestic." I'd been her sister's nurse for 9 years. I'd held Adelaide's hand the night she died. Persephone had not been there. Persephone had been on a cruise. I said, "I see." I said it softly. I said it the way a woman says it when she's been beaten down for too long and doesn't have any fight left. That was the moment, I think, that they decided I was finished. The next 2 months were a study in cruelty. Persephone moved out of the guest cottage and into the main house, which Carter said was more comfortable for her while we worked things out. Calliope, the 24-year-old, started showing up. Not constantly, but enough. She'd come over on Saturday afternoons. She wore my Adelaide's pearls one weekend, the ones Adelaide had specifically left to me in the will, and Persephone had handed them to her like a hostess gift. Carter called it letting things breathe. I was moved into the guest cottage. Persephone supervised. She walked through my closet with a clipboard, deciding what was reasonable for me to take. The cashmere sweaters Carter had bought me for Christmas, marital assets. The pearl earrings Adelaide had given me for our wedding? Family heirlooms, dear. They really should stay with the family. She packed half of my belongings into hefty trash bags. Not boxes, trash bags. While Renly watched from the doorway with her thumb in her mouth. That was the moment, I think, that I went quiet inside in a different way. The kind of quiet that isn't grief. The kind of quiet that's a decision. My best friend Rosalind kept calling. We'd been friends since we were 19. She'd been my maid of honor. She kept asking, with that warm concern in her voice, "How are you holding up? Are you fighting back? What's your lawyer saying?" It took me 3 weeks to realize that within a day of every conversation we had, Carter knew exactly what I'd told her. The first time I tested it, I told Rosalind I was thinking of countersuing for adultery and asking the court to freeze his assets. That night, Carter stayed up until 2 a.m. on the phone with someone who, based on the bank login I could see from the laundry room, was helping him move money into a new offshore account. So I started feeding her things. Different things. False things. Carter learned over those weeks that I was depressed. That I was on antidepressants I wasn't actually on. That my lawyer thought we had no case, that I was thinking about just signing whatever and moving home with my mother and giving up nursing because I was too overwhelmed. He absolutely loved that information. He couldn't get enough of it. The more pathetic I sounded, the kinder he became. He started speaking to me with a kind of theatrical pity. "Sweetheart, I want this to be easy. Just sign and we'll all move forward. You don't need the stress." I'd known Rosalind for 12 years. I had spent 12 years of birthdays and breakups and the night her father died with that woman. And she had sold me out, I would later learn, for the absolute pleasure of being told by Carter that she was different from other women, and that things might have gone differently if we'd met first. She got nothing for it. Not money, not a future. Just the cheap, sticky high of being chosen by a man who was going to be bankrupt within a year. I hope it was worth it. I really do. The hardest part wasn't Carter. The hardest part wasn't even Persephone with her clipboard and her trash bags. The hardest part was Renly. She was 4. She didn't understand what was happening, but she understood that her father, who used to swing her over his head and call her his princess, now barely looked at her unless someone else was watching. She understood that her mother had been moved to the cottage where Aunt Persephone used to live. She understood that the new lady, Calliope, was in the kitchen sometimes, and that the new lady looked at Renly like she was an unwelcome smell. One night in the cottage, after I'd put her to bed, Renly sat up in the dark and said, "Mommy, did Daddy stop loving us?" I said, "Daddy is confused right now, sweetheart." "But Mommy is not confused. Mommy loves you the same as always. Mommy is going to fix this." She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "Okay." And she went to sleep. And I went into the bathroom and I ran the water and I cried for about 4 minutes and then I washed my face and I went back to work. Henrietta laid out the plan in her office over a Tuesday morning coffee. We were going to give Carter what he wanted. All of it. Every signature he asked for, we would deliver. The main house, the 40 acres, the trust proceeds, the cars, the condo, the workshop, the timber stock, the chamber stock. He could have it all. But attached to every transfer document, in language so dry it could start a wildfire, would be a complete liability schedule. Mortgages, liens, the $1.4 million in commercial real estate debt his fund had taken on that I'd uncovered through public filings, the IRS notice he hadn't told anyone about, the class action wage claim filed by 3 of his former employees that was about to break wide open, the personal guarantees he'd signed against the condo, the fact that the trust he was so eager to claim had a clause Adelaide had written in by hand, and the presence of her attorney and 2 witnesses, stating that any attempt by either of her sons to access the trust corpus through pressure, fraud, or undue influence on Juniper Halloran Voss would trigger immediate forfeiture of the trust and a redirection of those funds in their entirety to a charitable foundation Adelaide had named in advance. Adelaide had known. Of course she had known. That's why she left it to me. That's what the sealed letter to Carter had been about, the one he'd opened and burned without ever telling me. But she'd left a copy with her attorney, and her attorney had given a copy to Henrietta. And Henrietta had been holding it for 16 months, waiting. "Here's what we do," Henrietta said. "We let him sign. We let him think he's won. We say nothing about the trust clause until he has put his name on every page. The moment he signs the asset transfer, the trust language activates, the corpus disappears, and he is left holding the debts on properties whose primary funding source has just walked out of his life. And then we let the room tell him what he's done." I asked her, "Is this legal?" She said, "Honey, it is required." I started rehearsing my role. I am not a natural actress, but I had been performing for so long by then that performing despair was almost a relief. I let myself look smaller. I wore the same gray cardigan to every mediation session. I let my hair go unstyled. I cried in the parking lot before I went in, just enough that my eyes would still be red when I sat down, and I made sure the mediator saw me wipe at them when I thought no one was looking. I asked for almost nothing, $40,000 in cash, Renly's primary custody, my personal belongings, including any items from Adelaide's room, for sentimental reasons. Carter laughed at that one. He let me have it. "Take the old lady's stuff," he told his lawyer. I don't care. He did not know that the old lady's stuff included a small fireproof box at the back of her closet that I had stocked, in the year before her death, with the original copies of every document Adelaide and I had built together while she was still lucid. Adelaide had asked me to. Adelaide had said, "Junie, my boys are going to come for what's in this house, and I want you to have what you need." I'd thought, at the time, that she was speaking from the disease. I'd written it off as one of her bad afternoons. She'd been having a very, very good afternoon. The week before the final hearing, Carter's lawyer, a man named Theodore Rourke, who had been practicing family law for 35 years, called Henrietta. He had a request. He wanted a financial review before signing. I just want to be sure my client understands what he's assuming, Theodore said. He was old enough and tired enough to smell smoke before he saw fire. Carter shut him down. Persephone shut him down harder. They were impatient. They had a Caribbean trip booked for the week after the divorce was final. Calliope had told Carter she wanted a yacht week, and Calliope was, at this point, getting whatever Calliope wanted. Theodore made Carter sign a waiver, a piece of paper that said in clear English that his attorney had recommended a full asset and liability review and that Carter was declining against advice. Carter signed it without reading it. He signed everything without reading it. By that point, he was signing his own name with the same careless flourish he used on a birthday card. The morning of the final hearing, I dressed in a navy dress I'd owned for 6 years. I left my hair plain. I did not wear lipstick. I drove to the courthouse with my mother in the passenger seat, and she held my hand the whole way, and she did not say anything because she knew I needed silence. Carter arrived in a new charcoal suit. His watch caught the light. Calliope was waiting in the hallway in a white dress that was almost, but not quite, appropriate. Persephone was in the gallery in pearls. Carter's lawyer Theodore looked, I noticed, tired in a way that was not just professional. He had the look of a man who had not slept well and did not know why. The judge was a woman named Marguerite Holcomb. She was in her late 60s, gray hair pulled back, and she had the gentle, exhausted authority of someone who had been listening to people lie about each other in her courtroom for 30 years. She reviewed the file. She looked up. She looked at me. "Mrs. Voss," she said, "I need to confirm that you understand what you are agreeing to today. You are relinquishing claim to property of substantial value, the marital home, the land, significant financial assets. Are you certain this is what you want?" I kept my voice soft. "Yes, Your Honor. And no one is pressuring you?" "No, Your Honor." She looked at me for a long moment. I could see her calculating whether to call a recess, whether to ask me into her chambers, whether to do the protective thing. "Your Honor," I said, before she could decide, "I just want my husband to have what he asked for. I want my daughter to have peace. That's all I'm asking for today." Carter actually nodded approvingly, from across the room, as if he were grading my performance. The judge sighed. "Very well, let's proceed." The signing took 20 minutes, page after page. Carter signed eagerly. He barely looked at the documents. At one point, he laughed quietly and said something to Theodore, who did not laugh back. I signed slowly, deliberately, the way you sign a card to someone you've loved a long time. I watched Theodore's face as he reached the last addendum, the liability schedule, the trust clause. I watched his eyes move down the page, then up, then down again. I watched him flip back to a page he'd already turned, then forward, then back. I watched the color drain out of his face from the temples down, like watercolor running. He leaned toward Carter and whispered something. Carter waved him off, smiling at Persephone in the gallery. Theodore whispered again, more sharply. Carter said, out loud in the courtroom, "Theo, relax. We're almost done. Let's just get this finished so I can take my wife to lunch." Theodore put his hand flat on the page. He said quietly, "Carter, read this." For the first time in his life, my husband actually read a document. I watched him. I watched his face. I watched the moment he understood that the trust was not coming with the house. I watched the moment he understood that the commercial real estate debt was now his alone, no longer cushioned by trust corpus he had been planning to drain to cover the shortfall. I watched the moment he understood that the timber stock had been pledged as collateral on a loan I'd known about for 11 months, and he had forgotten he'd taken. I watched him understand that the IRS notice that had been in his desk drawer for 6 weeks unopened was now a personal liability that no one was going to help him with. And then I watched him understand the part that was the most painful for him personally, which was that none of this had been hidden from him. Every document he had signed, every line item, had been there for him to read. He had simply chosen not to. He stood up. His chair shrieked across the floor. "She did this. She did this to me." Judge Holcomb's voice was a whip. "Mr. Voss, sit down." He sat. Theodore, to his credit, stood up next. He produced the waiver, the piece of paper Carter had signed without reading 3 weeks earlier. He read it aloud to the court. The waiver acknowledging that Carter Voss had been advised in writing by his own counsel to conduct a full financial review prior to signing and had declined. The judge looked at the waiver. She looked at Carter. "Mr. Voss," she said, "is that your signature?" A long pause. "Yes, and you understood at the time what you were declining." Yes or no, Mr. Voss?" "Yes." "Then this agreement stands. You assumed these obligations voluntarily after being advised against doing so." Mrs. Voss did not hide anything. The records were available. "You chose your own counsel, and you declined your own counsel's advice. $40,000 to Mrs. Voss. Primary custody to Mrs. Voss. All real and personal property and liabilities as listed to Mr. Voss. This marriage is dissolved." The gavel came down. Persephone made a small sound from the gallery, the kind of sound a woman makes when she watches her future fall through a hole she didn't know was there. I stood. I gathered my purse. I looked at Carter one last time. He was sitting with his elbows on the table, both hands in his hair, papers fanned out in front of him like a hand of cards he'd just realized he'd misread. I walked over. I leaned down. I said quietly, just for him, "You said you wanted everything except our daughter." "You got exactly that." I walked out of the courtroom. In the hallway, Calliope was already gone. She'd left while we were still signing. Someone had told her something. She was, as I'd predicted to Henrietta over coffee months earlier, faster on her exit than her entrance. The collapse, when it came in stages. Within 10 days, the bank that held the commercial real estate loans had filed notice. Within 3 weeks, the IRS had filed a lien on the main house. Within 2 months, Persephone had moved out, claiming she couldn't bear the negativity. She moved in with Adelaide's other sister down in Charleston, which I gather was not a happy arrangement. Within 4 months, the main house was on the market for less than half what Carter had assumed it was worth because of the liens and the back taxes and the deferred maintenance Carter had never noticed because Adelaide and I had handled it for years. Within 6 months, Carter was in his brother Beckett's guest room in Denver. Beckett, I heard later, made him pay rent in cash, weekly. Rosalind called me 3 times the week after the hearing. I let it go to voicemail every time. The 4th time she texted, a long paragraph about how she never meant for things to go this way and how we should talk. I did not respond. I never have. Some friendships are not friendships. They are auditions for a part you never knew was being cast. The $40,000 settlement covered first and last month's rent on a small 2-bedroom apartment in Westerville, plus a used dining table and 4 chairs, plus a soft pink bed for Renly with a canopy over it that she had pointed at in a magazine months earlier. It was not a lot. It was enough. The trust corpus, the $1.1 million Adelaide had set aside for me, transferred to the foundation she had named, exactly as she had wanted. I am not bitter about that. Adelaide and I had talked in her clearer days about what mattered. The foundation funds in-home dementia care for low-income families in 3 counties in central Ohio. Adelaide's name is on the door. My name is on the board. I sit on it pro bono and I vote on every grant. I kept my nursing job. I picked up more hours. I enrolled in an RN to BSN program online and finished it in a year. I am, as of 3 weeks ago, a registered nurse with a bachelor's degree, and next fall I'm starting a master's in geriatric nurse practice, paid for by the hospital where I work full-time. Renly is 6 now. She is in kindergarten. She is loud and funny and bossy, and she remembers almost nothing about the bad year. Sometimes she asks about her father, and I tell her the truth in the smallest way I can, that he is not well, and that he loves her, but that he is not able to be a parent right now. She accepts that. Children are kinder to absent parents than absent parents deserve. About 4 months after the divorce, Carter showed up at my apartment door. I almost did not recognize him. He had lost weight. The watch was gone. The suit was a suit he'd had since before we got married, and it did not fit him anymore. "Junie," he said, "can we talk?" I did not let him inside. I stood in the doorway in my scrubs, holding my coffee, and I looked at him. I made mistakes, he said. I know that. I didn't know it was this bad. I didn't know about the trust language. I thought. He stopped. He could not finish the sentence because there was no honest way to finish it. I said, you didn't know because you didn't read. He looked at his shoes. Carter, I said, you asked for everything except our daughter. I gave you exactly what you asked for. You don't get to come back and ask for the rest. Can I see Wren? You can see Wren in the way the court ordered. Supervised visitation, once a month. At the Family Services Center. You missed the last 2. If you miss the next one, the court will reduce it further. He nodded. He nodded for a long time. I think he was waiting for me to soften. I did not soften. I closed the door. I went back to my coffee. Renly called from the kitchen. Mommy, who was that? And I said, just somebody at the wrong address, baby. And I went and made her pancakes. That evening, after Renly was asleep, I sat on the floor of my small living room with a glass of wine and Adelaide's old recipe box on my lap. The recipe box was the one thing from her house I had truly cared about taking. Persephone had not even tried to claim it. She had not understood what it was. Inside the recipe box, behind the index card for buttermilk biscuits, was a folded note in Adelaide's handwriting from one of her good days, 4 years before she died. It said, Juniper, if you are reading this, things have gone the way I thought they might. Be patient. Be quiet. Keep your own money. Don't be afraid to let small men think they are winning. Yours, Adelaide. I read it twice. I put it back. I finished my wine. The apartment was quiet. Renly snored softly down the hall. Outside, the streetlight came on, the way it does at the same time every evening, casting a soft yellow square on my second-hand rug. It was small. It was mine. Every plate, every cup, every painted wall, every decision in the place was mine. And for the first time since I was 22 years old and had walked up the long gravel drive of the Voss estate with my nursing uniform in a duffel bag and my whole life ahead of me, I felt it. I was free. I think about that courtroom often, not because I take pleasure in what happened to Carter, although I won't pretend the first few weeks didn't feel like a window opening in a house I hadn't realized was airless. I think about it because of what it taught me about cause and effect, and how slowly and quietly those two things actually work in a life. Carter did not lose because I outsmarted him. Carter lost because for years he chose not to read, he chose not to look, he chose not to ask. Every single shortcut he took came back to him on the day he expected to collect his prize. The condo, the loans, the woman in his office, the brother he called when it suited him and ignored when it didn't, the mother he took for granted, the wife he treated like a houseplant, the daughter he treated like furniture. He didn't get punished for any one of those things. He got the bill for all of them on the same Tuesday in the same room in front of a judge who had been doing this work long enough to know that the universe does eventually balance its books and that it usually does so in writing. What I want to say to anyone listening, especially women, is that patience is not weakness. Adelaide taught me that in her clear hours and even in her foggy ones, she watched her son for 60 years, and she knew exactly who he would become when no one was checking on him. She did not confront him. She did not yell. She wrote a clause into a will and trusted the right person to hold the line. That is not bitterness. That is wisdom. And wisdom is the long form of love. I also want to say something about character. The real test of a person is not how they treat you when you are useful. It is how they treat you when they think you are finished. Carter and Persephone and Rosalind all looked at me in those last months of my marriage and decided I was someone they could discard. They were polite to me, in the way you are polite to a chair you are about to put on the curb. That told me everything I needed to know, and it told them nothing about what was coming. If you are sitting somewhere right now feeling small, feeling underestimated, feeling like the people around you have already written the ending of your story, please hear me when I tell you this. Being underestimated is not a wound, it is a quiet kind of armor. Let them think what they think. Keep your records. Keep your own money. Keep your daughter's bedtime sacred. Keep showing up to your shifts, your small daily acts of self-respect. None of it feels like power on the day you do it. All of it is. Adelaide left me a note in a recipe box. The note said, "Be patient, be quiet, keep your own money. Don't be afraid to let small men think they are winning." I read it the night the divorce became final. I keep it on my fridge now. It is the truest thing anyone has ever written down for me.